They say respect should be given to everyone who walks through the doors of a bank. But what happens when prejudice clouds judgment? One moment of arrogance can shatter an entire reputation. Have you ever seen someone go from power to humiliation in the blink of an eye? Let us know in the comments below. Brianna Flair stepped into the lobby of Flair Financial, her heels clicking lightly against the polished marble floors. It was her bank, her empire. Yet as she stood in line like any other customer, there wasn't a single glance of recognition from the staff. She was dressed in a simple navy blouse and tailored slacks, nothing that screamed wealth or status. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, her makeup minimal. The only sign of her position was the way she carried herself. Head high, shoulders straight, every step laced with quiet confidence. The line moved slowly. Brianna glanced around the room, taking in the details. The high ceilings, the floor-to-ceiling windows letting in natural light, the state-of-the-art security cameras. Everything meticulously designed to exude excellence. She had built this. Every loan approved, every investment secured, every policy put in place had her stamp on it. And yet, in this moment, she was just another black woman waiting to be served. The teller at the front counter, a young white man with slick-back hair and a smug expression, called out. Brianna stepped forward. The teller barely glanced at her as he asked, "What do you need today?" "I'd like to make a withdrawal," she said, sliding her bank card across the counter. The teller picked up the card and flipped it between his fingers, his expression tightening as he looked at her name. "Brianna Flair," he muttered, then let out a short chuckle. "You related to the owner or something?" Brianna raised an eyebrow. "Something like that." The teller scoffed, shaking his head. "Must be nice. What's the amount?" $50,000, Brianna said smoothly. The teller stopped. His fingers, which had been lazily tapping against the keyboard, froze mid-motion. He lifted his eyes, scanning her face with newfound scrutiny. 50,000? "Yeah." His lips pursed as he exhaled sharply. "Uh-huh. And do you have identification?" Brianna slid her ID across the counter, watching as the teller's eyes darted between her license and her face. "Hold on a second," he said, his tone shifting. He stood up and walked over to a manager near the back, a short, stocky man with a receding hairline. They exchanged hushed words. The manager's gaze flicked toward Brianna before he nodded. The teller returned, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Unfortunately, I can't process this withdrawal at this time," he said. Brianna tilted her head slightly. "And why is that?" He shrugged, feigning an apologetic tone. "It's just company policy. Large withdrawals require extra verification. I'll need proof of employment, recent pay stubs, and a written statement explaining what the money is for." Brianna leaned forward, resting her forearm on the counter. "Tell me," she said, her voice like silk, "do you ask for all that when a white man in a suit requests a large withdrawal?" The teller flinched. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, but he quickly masked it. "Ma'am, I don't make the rules. If you don't have the proper documents, I can't help you." Brianna took a slow breath, steadying herself. This wasn't new. She had fought these battles before, in boardrooms, in business deals, even in the very institution she owned. But it never ceased to sting, the way people like this teller looked at her, and saw a question mark instead of the exclamation point she truly was. She exhaled, her voice calm but cutting. "So let me get this straight. You're refusing to release my money, my own money, because I don't look the part?" The teller rolled his eyes, exasperation seeping into his tone. "Look, I don't have time to argue. If you have an issue, take it up with the manager." Brianna gave a slow, knowing smile. "Oh, I will." She stepped away from the counter and walked toward the manager's office. She didn't knock. She didn't ask for permission. She simply pushed the door open and stepped inside. The manager looked up, startled. "Excuse me, miss, but you can't just—" "I can—" she interrupted, closing the door behind her. And I will." The manager's face reddened. "If you have a complaint, you need to—" "Listen," Brianna said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I am Brianna Flair, as in Flair Financial, as in the woman who owns this bank. And right now I have a teller out there refusing to give me my own money because he assumes I don't belong. So tell me," she leaned in, her gaze unwavering, "how do you plan to fix this?" The manager paled. His mouth opened, then closed. He swallowed hard. Outside the office, the teller was still smirking, oblivious to the reckoning about to unfold. Customers murmured amongst themselves, sensing the tension. The atmosphere had shifted. Something was about to happen. And when it did, the entire bank would never forget it. The silence in the manager's office was thick enough to choke on. The weight of Brianna's words hung in the air, pressing down on the man behind the desk. He fumbled, blinking rapidly as if trying to process what had just been said. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His forehead glistened with a thin layer of sweat. "Miss Flair?" he finally stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I had no idea." Brianna cut him off with a sharp tilt of her head. "You didn't. And that's the problem." The manager swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I assure you this is just a misunderstanding. Our employees follow standard protocol for large withdrawals. It wasn't personal." Brianna narrowed her eyes. "That's the thing. It's always personal when people like me have to jump through hoops for something that should be routine. When a white customer asks for their money, they're treated like a valued client. But when I do it, suddenly I need to prove I belong. Explain that to me." The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Our policies are selectively enforced," she finished for him. The truth dangled between them, undeniable and sharp. The manager wiped his brow, his gaze flickering toward the door as if seeking an escape. But there was none. Brianna straightened. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk out of this office, call that teller over, and you're going to correct this mistake in front of every single person in that lobby. Loudly. Because if I walk out there and handle it myself, it won't be a correction. It'll be a public reckoning." The manager blanched. He hesitated, looking like a man staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. Then, with a shaky nod, he rose from his chair. Brianna followed him as he stepped into the lobby. The conversations hushed. Eyes turned toward them. The teller, still stationed at his post, barely spared them a glance. The manager cleared his throat. "Jacob," he called, his voice uneven. The teller, Jacob, looked up, annoyed. "Yeah?" The manager's expression hardened. "Step away from the counter." Jacob frowned but obeyed, his smirk still present. "What's going on?" The manager inhaled deeply, then turned to face the entire lobby. "I want to publicly address a serious mistake that occurred today," he began. "Ms. Brianna Flair, the owner of this bank, was denied access to her own funds due to an inappropriate and unfair assumption made by one of our tellers." Jacob's smirk vanished, his face drained of color. A ripple of murmurs spread through the lobby. Some customers exchanged knowing looks, others gawked at Brianna as if seeing her for the first time. Jacob stumbled over his words. "Wait, she... What?" "You heard me," the manager said, his voice firm now. "Miss Flair is the CEO and owner of Flair Financial. You refused her service without proper cause, and in doing so you violated not only our policies, but the very values this institution stands for." Jacob's jaw hung open. His eyes darted to Brianna. She stood tall, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Something wrong, Jacob?" His throat bobbed. I didn't know." "You didn't bother to know," Brianna corrected. "You saw my face, my skin, and decided I couldn't possibly be someone important." The weight of her words settled over him like a suffocating fog. The manager exhaled sharply. Effective immediately, Jacob, you're dismissed. Gasps rippled through the bank. Jacob reeled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. What? You're firing me? You left me no choice, the manager said, his voice weary but resolute. This bank does not tolerate discrimination, and we cannot allow employees who make clients, especially the woman who built this institution, feel unwelcome. Jacob's face twisted in disbelief, then fury. You're only doing this because she's the boss. If she wasn't, you wouldn't care. Brianna's expression remained cool, but her voice was razor-sharp. And that's exactly the problem. Chop scoffed, shaking his head. Whatever. This place is overrated anyway. He turned on his heel and stalked toward the door, but not before throwing one last glance at Brianna. You think you're special, huh? Just because you got lucky? Brianna met his gaze head-on. I'm not lucky, Jacob. I'm prepared. That's the difference between you and me. Jacob sneered but said nothing else. He pushed open the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk, disappearing into the city streets. The bank remained eerily silent for a long moment. Then a slow, steady clap rang out from one of the customers. And then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire bank was applauding. Some people nodded at Brianna with admiration, others whispered amongst themselves. The manager cleared his throat. Ms. Flair, I sincerely apologize. She held up a hand. Save it. I don't want apologies. I want solutions. He nodded quickly. Understood. I'll implement additional diversity training and ensure our hiring process prioritizes inclusivity. And if there are any other issues, I will personally address them. Brianna studied him for a long moment. Good, she finally said. The applause died down, and customers returned to their business. Brianna walked back up to the counter, where another teller, this time a nervous-looking Latina woman, waited. Ms. Flair, she said hesitantly, would you still like to make that withdrawal? Brianna smiled, sliding her card forward. Yes, please. The woman processed the request without hesitation, her hands steady, her voice professional. In under a minute, Brianna had her cash neatly counted and stacked before her. She placed it in her purse, then turned to face the room one last time. I built this bank so people like me wouldn't have to fight for dignity, she said, her voice steady but strong. If that standard isn't met every single day, then we aren't doing enough, and I expect more. With that, she turned and walked toward the exit. As the doors swung open, she felt the eyes of every person in that lobby on her, but this time they weren't questioning her presence. They were acknowledging it. She stepped out onto the street, the weight of the moment settling deep in her chest. The fight wasn't over, but today she had won. Brianna walked out of Flair Financial with her head high, the weight of her victory pressing against her shoulders. The sun felt warmer than it had when she entered, or maybe that was just the heat of her own satisfaction. It wasn't just about getting her money. It was about forcing the truth into the light, about making it clear that the days of quiet submission were over. As she made her way to her car, her phone buzzed. A text from her assistant Naomi popped up on the screen. Naomi, you set the bank on fire today. Twitter's already talking about it. Someone filmed the whole thing. Brianna exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Of course. Nothing happened in silence anymore. She tapped the link Naomi sent her and watched as a video played. A shaky but clear recording of Jacob's dismissal, of the applause, of Brianna's final words before she left. The comments underneath were already pouring in. This is the kind of justice we need more of. Sis walked in like a customer and left like a CEO. Imagine losing your job because you decided to be racist in the wrong building. Brianna chuckled to herself. The internet moved fast. This was already bigger than just a moment in a bank lobby. It was turning into something else, something with impact. She slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and let the quiet hum of the car settle her thoughts. She should have felt satisfied, maybe even a little smug. But instead she felt something deeper, a responsibility. This wasn't the first time she had to remind the world who she was. It wouldn't be the last. By the time she pulled into the parking lot of her corporate office, the weight of the day had started to set in. She strode through the glass doors, nodding at the receptionist, before heading straight to her office. Naomi was already waiting for her, phone in hand, expression unreadable. "You've got about a dozen interview requests," Naomi said before Brianna even had a chance to sit down. "CNN, Forbes, even a couple of international outlets. Everyone wants to talk to you." Brianna scoffed, shaking her head. "I didn't plan for this to be a spectacle." Naomi smirked. "Well, too late for that. You called out discrimination in real time, fired a racist employee on the spot, and reminded the world that a black woman runs one of the biggest banks in the city. This is news, Brianna." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know. I just don't want it to be about me. This is bigger than me." Naomi sat on the edge of the desk, arms crossed. "That's exactly why you should talk. People need to see this, to hear it, not just the drama but the lesson. You've been fighting to make banking more accessible for minorities for years. Now, the world actually cares." Brianna leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. She knew Naomi was right. She always was. "Fine," she said finally. "Set up the interviews." Naomi grinned. "Already ahead of you." The next few days passed in a blur of press, phone calls, and carefully worded statements. News anchors wanted to know how she felt, what went through her mind when she was denied her own money. Activists praised her, calling her a beacon of change. Others, predictably, tried to downplay the situation. Maybe it was just a mistake. Why do people always have to make everything about race? So, a guy got fired for following policy? Sounds like overreaction to me. Brianna ignored the noise. The work was more important than the chatter. And then came the phone call that changed everything. Her assistant rushed into the office, eyes wide, holding up the phone. "You need to take this." Brianna raised an eyebrow. "Who is it?" Naomi hesitated, then said two words that made Brianna's stomach tighten. "The board." Brianna took a steady breath before reaching for the phone. "Miss Flair," a deep voice greeted her. It was Edward Hollis, one of the senior board members, an old white man who had been in banking since the Stone Age. "We need to talk." She leaned back in her chair, fingers drumming against the desk. "I figured this call was coming." Edward cleared his throat. "Look, you know how much we respect you. You've built this bank into something remarkable, but there's concern." "Concern," Brianna repeated flatly. "About what?" There was a pause, then a sigh. "Optics." Brianna almost laughed. She had known these men long enough to predict their every move. "Let me guess," she said. "You're worried that me holding my own employees accountable might make some of our more conservative clients uncomfortable?" Edward hesitated. "It's not that simple, Brianna." "It never is," she murmured. "We just want to make sure this doesn't turn into a distraction. The bank's reputation is on the line, and while we support diversity and equality, we also have to consider—" Brianna cut him off. "Stop." Silence. She sat up, her voice steady but firm. "If this bank's reputation is threatened by the fact that its black female CEO refuses to tolerate discrimination within its walls, then maybe we need to reconsider what kind of reputation we're protecting." Edward sighed again, but this time there was something else in his tone. Resignation. "I had a feeling you'd say that." "Good," Brianna said, "because I meant it." Another pause, then Edward's voice softened. "You know, when you first joined this bank, a lot of us weren't sure what to make of you. You were young, ambitious, and—" He stopped himself before finishing that sentence. Brianna smirked. "And black?" A weak chuckle came through the phone. "Let's just say you proved us all wrong." "You earned this." She leaned forward. I didn't just earn this. I built this. Edward was quiet for a long moment. Then finally he said, "Carry on, Ms. Flair." The call ended. Naomi, who had been listening from across the desk, let out a low whistle. Well, that was a power move. Brianna exhaled, setting the phone down. It was a reminder, because if there was one thing she had learned in this industry, it was that power wasn't given, it was taken. It was fought for. And she wasn't done fighting. Brianna sat in her office, staring out at the city skyline. The world had shifted in the past few days, and she could feel it, like the air just before a thunderstorm, electric and charged with something inevitable. What started as a routine trip to her own bank had become a national conversation, a mirror held up to an industry that had long refused to see itself. Her inbox was flooded. Messages of support, stories from strangers who had experienced the same kind of discrimination but never had the platform to fight back. Invitations from financial panels, civil rights groups, and even a senator who wanted to discuss legislation about racial bias in banking. And then there were the threats, the hate mail, the anonymous messages telling her she had made a big mistake by stirring the pot. But Brianna had never been the type to cower. If anything, this was fuel. Naomi walked in without knocking, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. You know what's trending now? Brianna glanced over. Do I even want to know? Naomi held up her phone. Flair Justice. Some folks are calling you the banking boss who doesn't back down. Brianna chuckled, shaking her head. Catchy. If only they knew how much I hate hashtags. Naomi flopped into the chair across from her desk. Oh, they know. And they don't care. You're officially a symbol now. Brianna exhaled. A symbol. Great. Naomi studied her for a moment. You don't seem as thrilled as you should be. It's not about being thrilled, Brianna said, turning to face her. It's about making sure this isn't just a viral moment, that it actually changes something. Naomi nodded. And that's why I called this meeting, Brianna said, her gaze sharpening. Naomi raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Minutes later, the boardroom was full. The faces seated at the long glass table ranged from skeptical to expectant. Some of the older men, Edward included, sat stiffly, arms crossed. The younger executives leaned forward, eager to hear what their CEO had in mind. Brianna stood at the head of the table, cool and composed. I've spent the past few days thinking, she began. Thinking about the way this bank operates, the way the industry operates, and I've come to a decision. She let the weight of her words settle before continuing. We're implementing a full-scale audit of our policies, specifically regarding how we serve minority clients. That means an internal review of our loan approval rates, mortgage applications, and large cash withdrawal policies. I want transparency. Murmurs rippled across the table. Edward cleared his throat. Brianna, you know that kind of move is going to put a lot of eyes on us. She met his gaze head on. Good. Let them look. A younger executive leaned forward. Are we talking about just internal adjustments, or are you thinking of something bigger? Brianna smiled. Oh, I'm thinking bigger. We're launching a new initiative, the Flair Fund, a $50 million program dedicated to providing fair loans and financial education to Black and brown business owners who have been systemically shut out of opportunities. The room went silent. Edward exhaled sharply. 50 million? Brianna nodded. 50 million. And that's just the start. Another board member, a woman in her 40s, frowned. And how do we justify this to our investors? Brianna turned to her, voice steady. We justify it the same way we justify every other business move, by proving it works. This isn't charity, it's strategy. The racial wealth gap isn't just a social issue, it's an economic one. Investing in underserved communities isn't a risk, it's an opportunity. Edward sighed, rubbing his temple. You realize the backlash this could bring? Brianna tilted her head. The backlash from who? The same people who already tried to drag my name through the mud for holding my own employees accountable? The same people who don't want us to acknowledge that racial bias exists? They were never on our side to begin with. A few executives nodded in agreement. Brianna folded her arms. I'm not asking for permission, I'm telling you what's happening. Flair Financial is going to be the bank that leads this industry into the future. And that future isn't built on discrimination, outdated policies, or fear. It's built on progress. Edward studied her for a long moment. Then finally he leaned back in his chair and let out a dry chuckle. You really are fearless, aren't you? Brianna smiled. No, I'm just done playing small. Silence stretched across the room. Then, one by one, heads nodded, a few hesitant at first, but then with certainty. The meeting adjourned. As the executives filed out, Naomi lingered, watching Brianna with an impressed smirk. You just turned a moment into a movement, she said. Brianna exhaled. Not yet, but I will. Naomi grinned. Damn right you will. That evening, as Brianna left the office, she stopped by the bank one more time, not because she needed anything, but because she wanted to see it with fresh eyes. She stepped inside and watched as the new teller, Sandra, the Latina woman who had helped her after Jacob was fired, handled a line of customers with efficiency and respect. Brianna approached the counter. Sandra's eyes widened slightly before she smiled. Miss Flair, what can I do for you? Brianna returned the smile. Just checking in. Sandra nodded, then hesitated. I just wanted to say, what you did meant a lot to me, to a lot of us. Brianna's expression softened. Good. Then let's make sure it lasts. She turned, taking one last look around before stepping back onto the sidewalk. The city was still buzzing, still alive, still watching. She had changed something today, but the real work was just beginning.